Hello, Comics Alternative fans. Before we start with the episode, we want to invite all of you to check out our Patreon campaign.
That's right. Go to www.patreon.com/comicsalternative for more details. There, you'll find more information about the campaign and the cool rewards levels we have.
For as little as $1 a month, you can help us maintain good quality comics talk, and the more you contribute, the more perks you get.
These include monthly podcast episodes exclusive to Patreon supporters, as well as the chance to help us choose which books we review on the show. So be sure to visit www.patreon.com/comicsalternative and become one of our proud podcast patrons.
Yeah, and now on with the show.
This is the Comics Alternative, episode 241. Reviews of Boundless and User. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Paul, and we're two academics, one PhD and one inching closer and closer to it, talking about comics today.
Yes, that's right. And on this week's episode, Paul and I are going to be discussing two recent releases. We're going to begin with Jillian Tamaki's Boundless from Drawn and Quarterly. And then after that, we're going to look at User from Devin Grayson, John Bolton, and Sean Phillips, an Image release. But before we get into that conversation, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials, and May is no exception. Sometimes those specials will be as much as 45% off the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover, but often you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
One of those ways that you can get those awesome 50% discounts is through the various bundles that DCBS offers. And for this month, for May, you can get a Marvel Kids bundle. There's a Marvel Secret Empire bundle. There's all kinds of DC Rebirth bundles. And then there's Valiant bundles and DC Kids bundles, Young Animal bundles. So bundles are a great way to take advantage of significant discounts, most of them at 50% off. If you order through DCBS. And I should also mention that the title that we're discussing today, User, a hardcover from Image Comics by Devin Grayson and John Bolton and Sean Phillips, is also available through DCBS at a healthy 45% off discount.
That's right. Great discounts every single month at Discount Comic Book Service. Discounts in their name. Go to dcbservice.com for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Paul and Derek sent you.
That's right.
Well, Paul, I'm once again glad that you're joining me on the regular weekly review show. Andy is out of town for much of this week and cannot help with the show, but you have kind of a standing offer that anytime we need someone to fill in and you're available, you will jump to it, right?
This is great fun for me. I always love talking to you, Derek, and doing reviews with you. It's been fun for me to do the Young Readers episodes. So if folks have been listening to those, thanks for just being faithful listeners. But I don't just read Young Readers comics, so this is a good time for me too.
That's right. And we're going to be talking about things that, even though I think young readers could appreciate the two titles that we're looking at this week, User and Boundless, both of these are intended for a more mature audience.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Although, I guess it does make me think that some of the issues that both books take on are, I think, really relevant and important for, at least for young adults. And so, I enjoyed reading this from the perspective of thinking about, sort of later adolescents who might be encountering this kind of work and how, in some ways, liberating it would be for them.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, before we get into that conversation, I think we should make a couple of announcements about new patrons of ours through Patreon.
Yay! Do, 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 do.
That's right. Now, we recently got a patron who is backing us for at least $3 a month, so he becomes an official podcast patron, and with a capital PP, podcast patron, and this is Bob Hinsdale, and we want to welcome him to our list of official patrons. It includes as well Rainer Koshnick, David Campbell, Don Witzel, Sal Good Sam, Daniel White, Art Bowser, Christopher Baird, Scott Bufus, Sturge Bostakis, Ala Rull, and Davis Morgan. So, Bob, welcome to the club.
Yeah, welcome. And Bob, thank you so much for supporting the podcast. And as you listed all those names, so many of them people that we've heard from or had contact from, it just really heartens me, makes me feel like I'm, all this is part of a little family here we got going. So welcome to the family, Bob.
Yes, Bob, thank you very much for backing us and becoming an official podcast patron for the Comics Alternative. Now, but that's not all, Paul, because, and I kid you not, 2 minutes before I logged on to Skype for us to do this recording, I received an email from Patreon that we just got a new patron, someone who is backing us for $1 a month. And we love those who back us for $1 a month. And this is something, this is someone whom we've heard from a few times lately, and this is Jay Loving. He is now one of the backers at $1 a month. And this is great because over the past 2 or 3 weeks, Jay has been responding to the variety of interviews we've been doing, some of them with very high-profile names like Jeff Lemire and Matt Kent. And in fact, Jay provided the subtitle of last week's episode, Holy Balls, because that was his reaction over the series of interviews we've conducted recently. And yeah, we mentioned his and other people's tweets. Andy and I did last week when we did that episode, Publisher Spotlight on Koyama Press. So yeah, now he is a backer of the Comics Alternative. So Jay, welcome to the family as well.
Yeah, Jay, thank you so much for your support, for commenting and enjoying and, spreading the word on social media, and also for the term holy balls, which I'm sure will have a life beyond what you had ever thought.
That's right. Well, Paul, you want to get into this week's discussion?
Absolutely. I'm excited.
Okay, we're going to begin with Jillian Tamaki's Boundless. This is coming out from Drawing Quarterly the end of May. So as we're recording this, the book has not yet been released. But for all practical purposes, it's a new book, and we're going to talk about it as just out. So, and if you don't have your copy yet, everyone, think of this discussion as whetting your appetite.
Yeah. Boundless is a collection of work that Tamaki, some of it has been published before in Frontier and in other places. But I'm always kind of, looking forward to work from Jillian Tamaki, either the Tamaki cousins, who of course brought us before Super Mutant Magic Academy from Jillian Tamaki, and collaborated with this one Summer and Skim, a few works that really have a prized place on my shelf. So I was really excited to read this together.
Yeah, in fact, I was going to ask you what your experience is with any of the Tamakis. And so have you read all of those that you just mentioned?
Yeah, in fact, I have, and I'm excited that a colleague of mine who works in the school where I'm an instructional coach is planning to teach this one summer with his students, a group of his students next year. So I've been actually a little bit ratcheting up my reading to prepare to work together with him on that. So yeah, I a huge admirer of their work, including actually cousin Mariko, and sorry to put the mention on her when we're really focusing on Jillian today, but cousin Mariko has been doing some superhero stuff lately, a Supergirl title at DC and a Hulk title at Marvel, and that's been kind of interesting to see. So I think they're obviously different, but the each of them has a sensibility that I really enjoy in comics, and
yeah. Now I haven't read Skim yet. I've been intending to. My first introduction to any of the Tamakis was this one summer from, what was it, 3 years ago, I guess?
Yeah.
Yeah.
2014. Yeah.
Yes. And it was quite stunning. I thought that it was a really good book. And if I remember correctly, I think it was one of my honorable mentions for best of 2014 on our end of the year show.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. I think it's wound up on it's. I think it's made a quick entry into the canon. I just see it on so many best of lists, not just for the year, but recommended for syllabi and things like that. So and it's worthy of it for sure. Mm-hmm.
So let's talk specifically about this new collection of stories from Jillian Tamaki, Boundless. Now, you mentioned that some of these stories have appeared in other publications, and you're right. One of the stories, Sex Coven, was in Frontier issue number 7. Right. The story Half-Life appeared in Nobrow, and then there were about 5 other stories that appeared online, Hazlitt.net.
Yeah, which I'm not familiar with. Do you know Hazlitt?
Yeah, it's been a while since I visited there, but I didn't know that she posted, if not regularly, then semi-regularly to Hazlitt.net. So what that means is, because I did a rundown of the various stories in this collection, there are 2 of them. The very first one, World Class City, and then the fourth one Jenny, that apparently are new to this collection.
Yes, I did read that a couple things are new, even though for the most part we're reprinting things. I find that interesting because in the boundlessness, in the various ways of being boundless that this book is, it also doesn't seem bound by any demand that it should have a consistent origin. I like that it's a compilation of stuff republished and also stuff kind of new. Although there's some problems with that, as I'm sure we'll talk about. Yeah,
and I'm glad that you brought this up, because one or two of the questions that I had for you is, one, do you feel that this collection of stories stands up as a coherent collection in one form or another? And then along with that, do you think that any kind of creator, whether it be comics or otherwise, a prose writer, when they do a project like this, right, collect previously published material into one volume, I mean, do you think there's a need to provide some kind of coherency, maybe after the fact, to their collection of earlier previously published stories?
Yeah, those are great questions. I'm interested what you have to say too. But I mean, I think it is convenient if you're going to put a collection together that's eclectic to title it something like Boundless and to thematize the very sort of eclectic nature of the things that you're putting together. But I do think that there is a kind of almost more of a through line of a mood rather than maybe very specific themes or even really format or genre. There are pieces in this that are almost illustrated poetry, others that are clearly comics. The piece that you mentioned was part of was published in Frontier. A little bit more clearly sort of comics work in the sense of panels and things like that and a narrative. And others that are more impressionistic. And so I do think that it seems a kind of act of, I don't know, even formal defiance to put these together and to say, I dare you to make me have to have, some consistency to bind me together. But I think if it were coming from a creator who you had, I guess what I want to say is that you just are used to Jillian Tamaki being eclectic and diverse. I think, for instance, Super Mutant Magic Academy was a very sort of like formally structured kind of consistent webcomic whose narrative only with time, you could see the ways that it was woven together. Mm-hmm. And so it seems purposeful the way that she is going in a lot of different directions. And I think that to me, that is its coherence, even if it might be frustrating to not know what you're expecting. I don't know. Did you feel like that?
You mentioned the Super Mutant Academy. I think that's a different beast in that those were a series of originally webcomic strips that were collected, and they did have a kind of overt coherency that the individual stories in Boundless don't necessarily have. Now, getting back to those two questions that I ask you, do you see this as a coherent collection of 9 stories? And then, should a creator feel the need to make this kind of coherency? To answer that second one, I mean, I don't think one needs to. There's nothing wrong with getting things together that had been previously published here and there, and then pulling together in one text. And to do so, even for purely economic reasons, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, getting back to that first question, though, is there coherency to Boundless? I think that had Tamaki presented and arranged things in a slightly different manner, it may seem a little disconnected, but again, not necessarily in a bad way. But I very much appreciate what she's done in bringing in, let's say, a couple of new pieces, I guess, that hadn't been previously published, specifically World Class City and then one Jenny, along with the other 7 that had been previously published, because I think her arrangement, especially visually, does give a sense of completeness or coherence to this entire collection. I think first, given the title, as you've mentioned, right? So titling a book Boundless, that suggests something that isn't necessarily adhering to a certain category. I think it's a great, one way to give this kind of coherence. So Boundless also deals with the thematic nature of these stories and the stories themselves, right? There's no bounds in where they originally appeared.
Right.
But I especially like what Tamaki did in visually framing this book with the first story, World Class City, and then the final one, Boundless, because I do think that the beginning and end pieces go a long way to giving this book a sense of completeness. The thing that both of those stories have in common is the way you have to read them. And now both you and I are reading from a PDF.
Right.
Unless you have a hard copy that I'm not aware of.
No, I am too.
Yeah. I did pre-order my copy through our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. I just don't have that copy yet. So I'm having to rely on the PDF. And I think the most comfortable way to read this book, or at least those first and last stories, World Class City and Boundless, is if you turn the text 90 degrees and then you read that first story and then the last one in that manner, because that's the way the text is oriented, and even the visuals.
Yes.
Now, reading this on a PDF, it becomes a little difficult, and not just because of turning the electronic device, right? So, I was reading this on my iPad, and I usually don't lock the orientation, but I had to lock the orientation in order to turn my iPad to read it a little more comfortably. Again,
I did the same.
Yeah, and nothing wrong with that. But it's not just a matter of the orientation. One of the drawbacks of reading this particular book as a PDF is that with many of these stories, but especially the first and the last one, the pages would probably look much better in a full page spread, right? So looking at 2 pages at once, and there's some where that's necessary. You do get to see a continuation of image from one page to what I'm assuming will be on the facing page.
Right.
The PDF is a little problematic in reading it that way because you can only read one page at a time, and then you get to that next page and you feel like I felt like I kept having to back up to the previous page to get a full sense of the visuals.
That's right.
You know. So yeah. So again, that's one of the drawbacks of reading this on a PDF, but I think that's a relatively minor point. But my larger issue with the first and last stories is that they're presented in a very similar way. And so I do think that is a good strategy for visually framing the entire collection.
Right. And as far as giving coherence, that kind of book ending of a similar format at the beginning and end, with I think some thematic links as well, does do a lot to bring some coherence to the story. I think it's also, to the collection. I think it's also relevant that the way that as you said, a lot of those images cross over from one 2-page spread to another 2-page spread, which we kind of had to discover on the PDF. I don't know if your PDF reader does this too, but if I turn it to 2-page spread settings, sometimes it wants to group 2 pages together that weren't necessarily meant to be.
Right.
It just made me think a lot about, especially Drawn and Quarterly's attention to books and their material presentation, because D&Q books rarely show up on digital comics platforms, I notice, and I think that there's an import on the physical presentation of the text oftentimes with their work, which I think is especially interesting in this case because the opening story, if you want to call it that, in this collection is called World Class City, and the very first image is a drawn character who might be a stand-in for Tamaki herself, almost peering over the edge of the page as if it were the edge of a tall building, into, and the next page we see, the next 2-page spread, we see a glimpse of a face, which might be a carryover of that previous image. And again, sort of the images leak from one set of pages to the other. And it made me think about how when you read something digitally, we're supposedly dealing with what McLeod called the endless canvas, right? But actually, it's still limited in many ways, and it doesn't have what the book has, which is the ability to just watch a page flip over and get the sense of what the creator intended in terms of the experience of going from one page to another and feeling a sense of visual continuity between them. So I thought that was kind of an interesting thing, but it all to me speaks to what she seems to be intending by this boundlessness, this sense that neither panel nor page shall contain what is my exploration into many corners of this world.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Another thing that I think combines all of these stories together visually is the way that she has drawn and even colored when she chooses to these stories. Right. There are, unless I'm forgetting something, there is no story in this collection that has more than 2 colors. But many of them are monochromatic. In other words, they're either, if it's not black and white, then it is just one color, like a lighter green or a grayish look. Now, there are some like body pods that's made up, I think, primarily, if you don't count blacks, of 2 colors. And I think keeping the color choice consistent throughout works really well, and it does give all 9 stories brought together a sense of completeness and coherence. And so I enjoyed that. But you also mentioned the thematic similarities among these various stories. And I think all of them, if I were going to use just a few words to describe the tone or even the theme of these, I would say use words like unusual, even at times surreal.
Right.
Most, if not all of these stories have a real feel to them. In other words, I don't want to use the term slice of life, but they have a more realistic premise. That, in other words, it's a world, it takes place in a setting with people and all of that we could recognize, something that's definitely not alien for us, to us. However, in almost all of these stories, there's something just a little bit askew about this world that makes it, if not surreal, then has us scratching our heads asking, could this really happen? And I think one of the best examples of this is that fourth story, One Jenny. And I keep referring to it as One Jenny. The actual title of the story is One Period Jenny. The name Jenny. So that's why I'm calling it not Jenny, but One Jenny.
Right.
And the premise of this story is that the narrator and others discovers this mirror Facebook, right? So it's much like Facebook as we know it, but it's a social networking site like Facebook that is an alternate to the world and the profiles that we know. So, for instance, we have a particular profile on Facebook, but on this mirror Facebook, we could also have a profile, but it would create a reality for us that is not who we are.
Right. So my one Paul profile on Mirror Facebook would be going to parties that I didn't attend and, doing living experiences. And Jenny becomes quite obsessed with her one Jenny Mirror Facebook profile. Right.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that makes this story and many of the others in this collection so much fun is that what Tamaki will do is to ask something like asking a question, right? What would happen if, and then just add a very little spin to a reality that we all recognize. Right. And then she goes from there. And I think that One Jenny is a great example of that. Another story that does this really well, and is probably the one that I was most familiar with before this book came out, and that is Sex Coven, because this appeared in Frontier number 7, and I think we even discussed that on an earlier episode of the podcast. And with Sex Coven, it is, again, a world that we would easily recognize, right? It's basically the story of this song, if you want to call it that, or a sound file, maybe a better way of putting it, that in, let's say, the 1990s and the early days of file exchange, peer-to-peer, that people were downloading, and it seemed to have an effect, and it was really becoming popular. But the kind of effect that it would have is, how do I put this? It makes people, it puts them in a particular frame of mind. It makes them almost obsessed. And so it changes individuals ever slightly, cognitively and psychologically, both as individuals and as groups. And so then it becomes a phenomena, because not only are younger people who can listen to this sound file or this song in a particular way that maybe adults can't because of differences in hearing and age, they react to it one way. Adults react to it in another way, in other words, a more frantic way, saying, this is something that devil worshippers and evil influences are putting on the web to corrupt our children. And so that's, it's something that even though it seems a little bit unrealistic, it's not completely out of the realm of reality as we know it.
Right. Yeah. I agree. That sense of something, as you were saying, almost slice of life, but there's some difference, some awkward, something else that kind of comes in. And I think for me, for the majority of the stories, there's a specific kind of something else that seems to be disrupting just what you might call the normalcy. I mean, Tamaki shows that she's able to capture the sort of daily moments the way that, like, say, a Dan Clowes would, or even Adrian Tominay's recent collection. But I think what makes this distinct is that each of these stories in Boundless seem to have a concern with some aspect of consumer or internet culture that sort of breaks into that everydayness and either makes you question whether that is in fact something that is not real life or is real life, which, I think that speaks also to the next text that we're going to talk about, or in what ways that this built existence that we live within our cultures gets interrupted by nature. So, for instance, one of the stories, well, actually, there's one, Jenny, as you said, this idea of this mirror Facebook world. There's also a story called Body Pods, where it's kind of a funny story about how this kind of cult classic film burrows its way into the narrator's personal life and goes through various love interests and relationships that she has, and how each of them ends up getting punctuated by the presence of this movie, Body Pods, right? And the deaths of the actors, which kind of all end up reflected in her life and her relationship. And there's a way this cultural touchstone sort of insinuates itself into every part of the narrator's life. And so I think, to me, there's a way that Tamaki seems to be working out what it means to live in a sort of pop culture and internet saturated world in our daily existence, and how do we connect still to the natural world, bed bugs and such, right, or animals, when we have so much built world around us.
Right. Now, you mentioned the story Bedbugs. That's one. I think that is the more realistic or true to life of all of these stories, even though, as we've mentioned, all of these have that slice of life feel or that reality anchor in it in one form or another. But I think Bedbug is the one that's more just straight out realism. And basically that's the story of this couple who have bed bugs and how that has disrupted their lives in a number of ways. But also the bed bugs becomes a metaphor for how the relationship itself is bug infested in its own ways.
Right. She, is cheats on him with a student at one point, a TA, I think. But there's all these sort of like knowing looks where she's staring at this her husband and feeling the infestation of outside forces into their relationship, into their life together. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So if Bedbug is the most realistic of these stories, I think the one that is the most out there, or I would even call it science fiction-y, is Half-Life. And this is something that, it begins realistically enough, right? We have the protagonist, a young woman who notices that she is slightly smaller than she thought she was, or shorter than she thought she was. But what we come to discover is that she is actually shrinking. So you have, this is basically the story of the incredibly shrinking woman. Right.
Yes, I thought the same thing. Right. Yeah. It's really interesting in a sort of Benjamin Button-like fashion. It's like, what would happen if, if you did have a chemistry kind of Half-Life effect, and you just got smaller and smaller, and people around you had to figure out, like you said, at first kind of jokingly, like, hey, you seem to be getting shorter, but then like you're disappearing into the size of an atom. And
literally that's what happens.
That's right. Yeah. And so it's an interesting kind of, to me, that story speaks a little bit to it, a lot of the story is her narrating her feelings and thoughts as it's all happening, and little accommodations she has to make, taking up watercoloring because it seems to be a pastime that you can do when you're tiny. And then her sister sewing clothes for her, like doll-sized clothes. But it also is kind of, it reminds me a little bit of what reading the Benjamin Button story. I never actually saw the movie, but reading the story makes you think about, which is we take for granted so many aspects of our social life and also our built environment, the world that we live in. But when something goes kind of wrong with the normal progression, or something goes askew with the normal progression of how we experience our bodies and our lives, it just kind of calls forth. It just makes you notice how funny things are. All the world around us that we take for granted suddenly looks really, really different when you're, say, shrinking.
Yeah. Well, the way that you put that, it makes us aware of our bodies in a way that maybe we didn't think of before.
Right.
It reminds me of another story in the collection, the third one, The Clare-Free System. Now, this is a more realistic story, kind of along with Bedbug. But basically what it is, it's a short piece narrated by someone who is not only using, but now selling what's called the Clare-Free System, which is, a system of skincare that's supposed to give you clearer skin. And so the manner in which this piece is narrated is almost as a sales pitch. Yeah.
It's actually reminiscent of those network marketing pitches, and actually she makes explicit mention, the narrator, of this whole idea of, hey, I sell this product and all of a sudden, I can quit my job and I get all this revenue from all these other people that I've, fooled into or convinced into this lifestyle of selling this product. And so it's interesting. I thought that was a really interesting story in terms of the contrast between the words and the images. I don't know if you had any feeling about the choice of, on one hand, the language of, here's it comes to become, it starts out sounding like a kind of confessional, but it very soon veers into a sales pitch. But I thought the images were really interesting in terms of what's coupled with them.
Right. And even though the association between the image and the text makes sense, I think of all of the stories in this collection, this is the one where there is the most discontinuity, even though not complete discontinuity, between text and image.
Yeah. I mean, it's like a hand lotion that's being sold or something like that, right? And there's no, everything is very black and white and very spare and kind of pen and ink. And so you're used to hand lotion commercials being very lush and full of kind of pink and fleshiness, and that's sort of been removed. It's kind of been abstracted from this, and instead it's slightly terrifying, some of the images, or at least very austere, and it's just kind of the opposite of the tone that the marketing language tries to create.
Right. Now, one of the stories that we haven't discussed yet is Darla, and it's not just Darla, but Darla ! Right?
Right.
And this is not that long of a piece. There's some of these stories in the collection that are longer than others. So, for instance, One Jenny is a long story. I think Sex Coven is relatively long. Same with Bedbug. Darla, though, I wanted to bring this up because, in ways like you were mentioning about the second story, Body Pods, which says something about pop culture and the way that it not so much infiltrates our life, I guess that, but also the way that we use our popular culture as markers in our own lives. There's something similar going on with Darla. Now, the premise of Darla is that back in the 1990s, there used to be a sitcom that was based, I guess they call it a porno sitcom, right?
Right.
And so this was popular for a while. Just the very premise that on what looks to be something like network television, if it's the 90s, it probably would be, a porno series that's also a sitcom.
Yeah.
Really? But, again, this is one of those stories where Tamaki tweaks things slightly and then runs with it in a way that makes it very convincing. And unless I'm mistaken, unless I'm misremembering, it's not until we get toward the end that we realize who the narrator is.
Yes, exactly.
One of the original creators. And this is not someone who watched it and it was a part of their life, kind of like we get in Body Pods. But this is someone who was actually one of the creators, because in the last few panels we see that he is, he's an older guy and he goes around to these conventions and, years later, this younger demographic are flocking to him, wanting to know more about this. And he just kind of feels disconnected from this new audience of his just because, he's older. And he approached this porno sitcom in ways different from the rest of, I guess, his newer fans have.
Yeah. I mean, actually, I thought this was one of the more affecting stories for me. There's a kind of even sweetness in that he was utterly earnest about this endeavor. I mean, on one hand, earlier in the narration, he says, well, what can I say? It was the 90s and we were doing a lot of cocaine. But, by the end, when he's, on one hand, excited. On the other, kind of disillusioned by the young people's response of this to this new kind of cult hit. He's, it seems like the kids are enjoying it very kind of ironically, and he's a little, as he says, a little too snide, too winky, and it seems, kind of off-putting to him. I thought that was kind of poignant, actually. First the reveal that we find out who it is that's narrating this, and then the sort of feeling that he has that just kind of shows, I kind of meant this, like I wanted this to be good, So I thought that was really interesting.
Right. And the title of the story gets its name from the star of the show, an actress by the name of Darla Nakamura. Mm-hmm. And even though we see her visually throughout the story, she never has a presence outside of the narrator's memories, because at one point, we don't know what happened to Darla. The narrator says, as for Darla Nakamura, I'm not sure where she ended up. Hopefully married to a nice guy with a couple of kids. Sweet girl.
Right. Yeah. I wonder a little bit if Tamaki is playing with our expectations to some extent. I mean, I know this is, again, one of the pieces that was published earlier, but I think people probably don't all make this mistake, but I tend to make the mistake that whatever character looks, sort of ethnically or gender wise, most like the creator is the one who's the stand-in for the creator. And if that's true of any readers, then she's sort of twisting that expectation by hiding who the narrator is and then revealing at the end that it's this guy, Frank, the producer, and in a way playing maybe with some of our expectations about author and narrative voice.
Right. Yeah. And in fact, now that you mentioned that, I'm looking over all of these 9 stories, and there's really not one here that I would say absolutely serves as, let's say, an example of what you just mentioned, where the protagonist and or narrator is the stand-in for Jillian Tamaki. And the reason I say that is I think that when it comes to her comics, there's not necessarily that presence, right? That's the kind of writer she is, that she can present a story in different narrative voices from different perspectives. And if we expect the more, as you put it, ethnic looking character in the story to be her, then that's more on us as readers than what she does as an artist.
Right, definitely. I mean, in a way, it's expressing boundlessness, right?
Yeah. Another example of Boundless.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's part of what impresses me about this collection. I really liked it overall. And it feels of a piece to me, as I was saying earlier with her previous work, not because her previous work was like this, but exactly because her previous work wasn't like this. In fact, Skim and This One Summer and Super Mutant Magic Academy are all really different. And so Tamaki demonstrates a kind of range that I think is really impressive and is displayed here too.
Yeah, I agree. This is different from the earlier works that you mentioned. And what I'm curious to know is if she takes this more, if we want to call this kind of a more experimental text, or a collection of more experimental narratives, if she will take this experimental tone to another project that we can expect in the future, a more long-form book. I mean, something like This One Summer or Skim, but with kind of a different feel to it, like we have in the stories in Boundless.
Right. Yeah. That would be interesting. On the other hand, I would also just love a full comic featuring the squirrel that she draws, who declares that my bones are so fucking light that I can sit on the tiniest branch. I think that would be awesome. And then decides he can't cross the barrier of another squirrel's urine marking territory.
Right. And we should mention that, inappropriately enough, as we're wrapping up our discussion of Boundless, that you're referring to the last story in this collection, Boundless.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep, which features kind of a stringing together from page to page, as we were talking about earlier, of various natural creatures, but overlaid with a narration that is, what would it be like to be this squirrel or bird or insect?
Right. Yeah, and I don't want to mention too much about the last animal that is narrating in the story Boundless, because I think it may give something away. I do have to say that I expected that ending, but the way that Tamaki presented it didn't seem overly obvious to me. I liked it.
Yeah, and it was tonally a kind of perfect fit with the whole volume, actually. I wonder if that's just a little bit tonally what Tamaki's like.
Yeah.
Yeah, I liked it too.
So let's move on to the second title that you and I are discussing this week, and this is User. This just came out this week as we record this from Image Comics. It is written by Devin Grayson with art by both John Bolton and Sean Phillips. Now, we should mention that even though this is coming out as a hardcover single volume edition from Image, that User originally appeared as a 3-issue miniseries from DC's Vertigo imprint back in 2001. Right.
And was never reprinted after that. So, at least one reason for this printing is Grayson and the creative team just really wanting to have it available, because I think folks who knew about this story but wanted to hunt it down would have a really hard time getting all 3 of those prestige format volumes from before.
Yeah. So when you mentioned that this wasn't reprinted, you mean this wasn't this didn't come out as a trade?
Yeah, sorry.
Just the 3 issues.
That's right. 3-issue prestige format. And I think I've read in an interview Grayson saying something like people would look for it on Amazon and you'd order it and you never knew which issue you were going to get, sort of thing, so I think there's some confusion there too.
Okay. So, as I mentioned, this did originally come out in 2001. And so I guess my first question for you, Paul, is, well, okay, let me back up a bit. First, let me ask, did you read this when it first came out?
Oh, no. Actually, I didn't even know about it until the announcement of the solicits for this re-release. Yeah. Okay,
because I had heard about it, but I didn't read it until this Image release. So now to my question. Knowing that this originally came out in 2001, and it's written in its time, right? So given the technology, especially when it comes to social media or interactions, let's say communications online, at the time, which is vastly different from what it's like right now, 16 years later. Did the experience of reading User seem a little, did you feel that it was a little dated? In a way that caused you some minor annoyance, perhaps?
Sure. It's interesting. I mean, I think that, well, certainly the computer that the main character Meg uses, and maybe we should say it's a story about Meg, who's a young adult, starting off a career, but really becomes obsessed with an online what do you call it?
A MUD?
MUD, right.
Yeah, multi-user dungeon, so it's all text-based, right? So
that's right. So it's like an RPG played online, but basically writing text in this on this interface that looks like DOS. And so it wasn't off-putting to me, because I think I was 21 at the time that this came out. So I remember computers being that way. It actually felt to me, I guess, with the knowledge that it's set in that time, pretty prescient for what was to come, in our broader gaming culture and things like that. What was to become far more widespread. I think it seemed like Grayson and company were, telling a story from this tiny corner of the world that blew up and became the whole world. And so I think if I didn't know that this originally came out in 2001, maybe I would feel like, why are we, there's so much more relevant time and place for you to tell this story. But I think knowing that it did come out at the time that it did originally, and knowing that it's mostly unaltered since then, it just felt actually really futuristic to me, really kind of cognizant of where things were going.
Yeah, exactly. And, I guess I feel similar to you in that knowing that it was originally created when it does set a context to where, I don't have an issue with the quote unquote datedness of if not the subject matter, then the way, I guess the actions, right? What transpires.
Right.
And there is a 1-page essay, or I guess introduction by Joan Hilty. And, Hilty does mention
editor. Yeah.
Yeah. The context when she originally worked on this, and she does mention the changes in technology since this time. So, if people are coming to User for the first time and they skip the introduction, especially younger readers, right, who are very much aware and enmeshed in today's gaming technology, they may be a little perplexed and even put off by the unrealistic nature, as they would see it, of what goes on in User. So I think it's important to have that kind of context, which you could get from the introduction to this new image collection. But I think, given all that, I do think that this is a fascinating story. And even though the technology around which the story is built does appear a little antiquated, relatively speaking, the larger themes that are involved here, I think, are very much of our time. Maybe even more so than it was. And so, you mentioned the setup of the story, that this is a young woman in her 20s. She's not been out of school that long. Her name is Meg or Megan. And she has a job. And what is her job? It's at a company where she deals with technology and computers, right?
Yeah, I think it's something related to corporate end of a HMO business or something, but she's doing the tech stuff and she's knows how to do the mainframe, or I'm just throwing out words now. I don't know.
No, and she has her own computer at home, which again, this is 2001. And at the time that wasn't that common. And that becomes apparent in this story, right? Because there are a couple of moments where people will talk to her about her computer at home as if it's something unusual. Now it's every day. We carry computers in our pockets, but at the time it may have been a little out of the ordinary.
Yeah. The most telling part is when her father roars in with a phone bill because she's used the modem so much that it's like a monstrous phone bill, which is it definitely dates it to that time.
Yeah. Another thing that adds some temporal context here. But as you mentioned, she gets enmeshed in this online gaming community to the point that this starts to consume her life at the expense of her Monday or everyday mundane life. And that causes problems. But I think the part of this story that is so thematically significant and even more resonant today than maybe the time that it was originally published is what it has to say about the way we represent ourselves, our identities, especially as it relates to issues of gender identification.
Yeah, definitely. And disclaimer that about the high probability that I'm going to say something as a critic that reveals my ignorance, as a cis hetero male non-gamer. So apologies in advance for that. But I think that there is something about the opportunity provided in this kind of imaginative social environment of an RPG to reimagine gender, to not just have things assigned to you, but to be able to be fluid in terms of your representation of yourself and in terms of your who you're attracted to, who you flirt with, who you how you show yourself, that becomes for Meg an opportunity. We should also mention that part of the story is that her OOC, or I forgot what this stands for, but out of character, her in real life experience includes parents who are divorcing or separating, and a sister who's being abused by him, being molested in front of her father's eyes, and he's doing nothing about it. He's sort of turning a blind eye to that reality. And so there's some really dark things that are part of her real life world that makes sense of why, maybe partly makes sense of why she's so eager to run from it and into this fantasy world that's provided. But also, some of that stuff about gender too. You can imagine that some of those circumstances I just described makes her yearn for a place where gender roles and designations are not so rigidly, fixed.
Right. And I want to get back in a moment to what you mentioned just now, and that is the kind of screwed up nature of her real life, her mundane life with her parents and, let's say, the neighbor especially, and her sister.
Right.
Because I have a few things to say about that. But getting back to what we were discussing in terms of the theme here and gender identity, I think this is one of those books that, as I said a moment ago, it's probably more appropriate now than it was at the time.
Right.
When it was written, it's not as if issues of LGBTQ were something that people were really overt about, right? And so there are ways of kind of coding those possibilities or those themes that would make it safer for publication at the time, and where you don't have to worry about that so much today. I found it curious, if you look at the very back of this book, where it has, the blurbs of endorsement from, among other people, Brian K. Vaughan and Kieran Gillian. But they designate this book, Image has designated this book dark fantasy / LGBT. Now, the dark fantasy is like, what subject matters does it fall under? I could definitely see dark fantasy. LGBT, I think that if someone picks this up thinking that they're going to get a more overt treatment of LGBT-related issues, may be a little disappointed, because I don't think that there is a full immersion or enough of an immersion into that theme to really justify that tag on the back cover. But again, given its time, it was, I guess, as close to something LGBT-ish as one could get. But I even think that designation on the back of the cover, LGBT, is even limiting that, because it's not so much that as gender identification in a much broader sense, right? And even then, it doesn't go, I guess, as far as some people may want. And again, you have to put the reading of this within a particular context, a historical context.
Right.
So some people who come to this may be expecting something, not only in terms of the technology, but also in terms of the LGBT expectations, according to the back cover, that they might not get. Does that make sense to you?
It does. I hear what you're saying in the sense that maybe one aspect of it is that it's not explicitly called out in the text that she is, in some sense, identifying in her real life context. Although maybe not necessarily, but yeah, I don't know. I like the label though. I mean, I feel like one of the things that Grayson said is that I think that she has a stepson who she herself calls, a transsexual, 15-year-old transsexual, who also does role-playing stuff and who has enjoyed the kind of online community that she describes, that she depicts in the story. And so part of the reprinting this book is that, she dug up this book and realized, wow, it really was very much before its time, and there's probably many more people who would appreciate it now. And I guess my contention would be that it's steeped in LGBT issues and themes because so much of that is about public identity and your ability to create, to choose, to cast a public identity, and then to relate to people in ways that are not so stringently defined. And I think that's part of what the world, the fantasy world, affords for her. You kind of see relationships that are, of different kind of gender orientations and sexual orientations first in the fantasy world that, not to give too much away, that do have carryover effects into Meg's real life by the end of the story. And so to me, that's I think you may be right that it's of the time in the sense of not coming through the front door and saying, we're tackling LGBT issues. But on the other hand, it's sort of so clearly resonant with all of, with many themes that are important to that kind of literature that I can see why that label becomes, not just something to really to narrow it, but to say this work reaches out to that. The audience is looking to read about that, that set of issues.
Right. And, I didn't mean to suggest that label on the back cover is inappropriate. I don't think that at all. I was mentioning that because I think that there may be some readers, maybe younger readers, as we were talking earlier in terms of the technology, who may come to this book for the first time and expect something that it doesn't deliver on, but for very understandable reasons. So again, another reason why temporal context is important to keep in mind when reading users.
That's a great point, actually. I mean, and I don't know if this is what you're referring to, but like, for instance, the creators on the back cover, Vaughn and Gillen, they're writing in a time and of a time where certainly none of these issues are like resolved in the public, but we're at a place where you can tell stories where you don't have to always self-reference that we're transgressing traditional boundaries of gender and so forth, right? Like you can just kind of take for granted in Saga, for instance, that there are trans characters and so forth. And Grayson is writing at a time where you have to self-reference. You have to sort of qualify or explain in some way, in ways that in a lot of contemporary comics like those, you don't, and it's awesome that you don't. But it does. I mean, to tie it to a not connected but maybe somewhat related issue, I think there's also it's interesting to think about the sexual violence that is depicted in this story, particularly with Meg's sister Annie, and how that kind of sexual violence plays today in contemporary comics when the critical community sees it. Grayson herself has sort of been through various controversies and I think has gone back and forth about the depiction of sexual violence in comics and how the comics reading community today receives that is different from how it was in 2001. And I think that's something to be cognizant of too.
Right. Okay. So I want to use your mentioning of what happens with Meg's sister Annie and how she is apparently abused by their neighbor Cal as an entry point in something that I referenced earlier, and that is the kind of unhappiness in Megan's real life and what basically drives her to the virtual world of MUDs as an escape. I like User, but I want to, I guess, moderate my appreciation of it because I think the book, and this has nothing to do with its temporal context, right? When it was created. As I've mentioned, I think thematically, it's probably even more appropriate now than it was when it originally came out in 2001. Right. I think that on the level of thematics, what maybe higher order ways of appreciating the book, I think that this book is at its strongest. But on lower, or maybe I should call story level issues, that's where things broke down for me and took me out of the narrative, and I kept wondering, how is this possible? And I'll tell you what I meant by that. Two things that are very disruptive in Megan's world, and you mentioned the relationship with her parents, and this abuse that I think it's their neighbor, it's his father's best friend, Cal, and Cal abusing Annie. Now, Annie, the sister, is she still in high school, I believe?
I think so.
At least, yeah. Okay, so basically the situation is that the neighbor, Cal, who is a close friend of Megan's father,
Right.
Every now and again, for like almost no reason, right? It's like a sitcom, like the wacky neighbor Kramer who comes over for no reason. But Cal comes over and hangs out with the father, and he's a little chummy with Annie, a little too chummy, in fact, because
it's gross, right?
When other people aren't around, he not only is a little more intimate, but he is abusive. I mean, it's statutory rape, probably, right? I mean, we don't know exactly how old Annie is. So there's that. And then there is the situation between Megan's parents, where at the very beginning of this story, her mother is leaving, okay? So we know that there's something askew with her parents' relationship. My problem with User is, again, on the story level, there's a lack of motivation and coherency in terms of the story. Now, granted, if the primary focalizer of this narrative is Megan, and if Megan doesn't understand everything that's going on in her real world, she can't grasp it, or it's causing some kind of disconnect in her life, then okay, it would make sense that some of these elements don't make complete sense. You know, the real life elements, you know, her sister and the neighbor, and then her parents' relationship. I understand that. But we as readers should be able to see a little more coherency and motivation among characters and the actions they perform. What I mean by that is, at the very beginning and throughout the narrative, we don't learn this at all. By the time the story ends, still a big question mark. What's going on with the mother? And what is it about her that causes her to abandon the family? Now, the husband doesn't seem abusive, right? Megan's father. Maybe he's a little detached, and so perhaps that's the reason that the mother is leaving the family and leaving, in essence, Megan in the situation that she's in. But we don't know that for certain. And in fact, it's entirely possible that the mother is just irresponsible, and so she's one of the ones who's causing the neighbor to abuse her younger daughter. We don't know. Again, there are big blanks there that aren't really filled in, and I think had I known a little more about why the mother did what she did at the beginning of the book, leaving the family in essence, things would have made a little more sense to me. Something similar with the neighbor abusing Meg's younger sister. How is it that if if Megan notices this, that the father doesn't? I mean, that just seemed a little too unrealistic to me. I mean, this is someone who meticulously checks out the phone bill, right?
Right.
So, I mean, okay, you can attend to those kind of detailed manners and miss the larger parts of your life. I understand that. But it just seems a little unbelievable that the father is not seeing anything that Meg is seeing in terms of Cal and Annie. And every time I came upon those moments when Cal is being abused, especially fairly early on in the book, when both the father and Meg are coming home at about the same time, Meg looks into the house window, and I didn't even know what was going on at first, but apparently it is Cal basically taking Annie. I mean, he is having his way with her, and the father doesn't see that at all. I mean, and not just at that moment, but in any sense of the word. That just struck me as a little unrealistic. And so those moments took me out of the story. So that's why I say the larger thematic issues is where User is so strong. But when it comes on just a simple basic story level, there's some gaps there that had me scratching my head.
Yeah, I think I know what you mean, and I felt exactly the same way. It's more than discomforting when in an early page, Cal, this neighbor, is so clearly harassing, really in terrifying ways, this girl who's, I think you're right, supposed to be a minor, and the father is literally turning his head and reading a newspaper and saying, and ignoring her cries for, leave me alone. And I mean, I think that's it does reek of a kind of unrealistic, almost like exaggerated depiction. But a few things I would say is, later on in the story, Meg confronts him about it. He seems almost purposeful in his turning a blind eye,
The father?
And so, yeah. And so on one hand, it seems unrealistic that he would so clearly ignore what's right before his eyes. And on the other hand, I think that's part of what Meg feels like she's experiencing and maybe is part of this world that I would also think is sort of like unrealistically possible, but given, who we just elected and what he said publicly and how willing people were to swallow that, I don't know. I mean, I do think that all of it is fairly extreme, including everything that happens with, the mother who maybe is abandoning the family, fairly extreme. And if it's extreme and it's, really meant to drive and to push why Megan would be so eager to escape and find something different, then I can understand narratively why it's that way. From the very first page, we can see that she is already, turning her real life trauma into a fantasy escape. And I think that is hit pretty hard right from the beginning. And so I'm not saying that this isn't what actually is happening in her real life or in her home, but if the temperature or the volume on that is turned up a little bit to really hammer home why she, sort of disappears into this drug of the role-playing fantasy life, that to me justified narratively why it just is so egregious what she's living through. But on the other hand, I think there's something also about Sean Phillips's art where so I don't know if we said this, working with two artists here, right? And John Bolton, who has done a lot of horror and fantasy stuff, does the gaming world, and Sean Phillips does the real life world. And I don't know if it's because of reading so much Brubaker and Phillips stuff, but he's got this quality, right? Sean Phillips's art does of being almost photorealistic, but this sort of smudgy watercolory shadow that makes everything look real, but also like tinged with this horror, and so it felt also like Meg's real life circumstances had to be sufficiently horrific to both to warrant Phillips's art, but also to create that real sense that this is really scary. There's no Brubaker Phillips like tentacled creatures that are going to appear in her real life, but the tentacled creature has to be somebody as horrible as Cal, this neighbor.
Right. I'm glad you pointed out the differences in art, and the style changes depending on whether you're in the Mundy world, the mundane world, the everyday world of Meg, right, or the online fantasy, basically what she's experiencing in her head, right? Because, this is a text-based activity that she's engaged in. Right. And so, Bolton's art looks more iconic, brighter colors, whereas you're right, Phillips has more of a noir feel to it. Right. That does present almost a horrific nature of reality as opposed to the fantasy life. Although I do have to say, I love the art of Sean Phillips, the older as well as the contemporary. Yep. And one of the things that I noticed in User, an earlier work of his, is that especially when it came to expressions, facial expressions, there's kind of an exaggeration that seemed a little bit too much at times. I mean, I do see this in his current work, but I think he tones it down a bit. Yeah. Where you see someone who is surprised or horrified, or they have a quizzical expression on their face. You definitely know their mood or what they're experiencing through the facial expressions. In this earlier work from 2001, there are some of the expressions that seem exaggerated, and perhaps they're exaggerated in order to create this kind of maybe sense of horror that you pointed out, that there's something kind of dark and weird and frightening going on in Meg's real world. Yeah.
I wonder if they were recreating it now, both in terms of the narrative on the part of Grayson and in terms of the art. It's pretty extreme in terms of how toned into a very mundane life Phillips's art is, and then how candy colored and really very fantasy Bolton's art is. I think it's gorgeous, but I wonder if on all ends of that, if they were making this today, they would have toned it down a little bit, Yeah.
I guess maybe another way of saying what I said about the expressions with Phillips' art in this book is that it's a tad expressionistic in that, a little over the top, but maybe for good reason.
Right. Yeah, maybe for good reason, or maybe, I don't know. I mean, I think I'm just trying to think back to my 2001 brain, and how I think too much subtlety a lot of stuff would have been lost on me, that today we're more attuned, I think, to pick up. But yeah, I think it's really effective. Bolton's work creating that world. I love how the fantasy world is all foreground and figures, and there's like kind of a fuzzy, blurred photograph kind of background. Not even a photograph because it's just kind of cloudy. But that to me as a way that your imagination would make this would make this fantasy world all about the characters and the figures, and sort of what actual setting or context you would be in would become fuzzy. It made me think a little bit. Actually, if you tried to make this story in 2017 or even in 2010, the video games somebody would be playing would have so many visuals that you actually couldn't have the fantasy world be this totally in her mind imaginative place. You know what I mean?
That's a good point.
The fact that it's completely text-based, and I know there's still text-based RPGs that people play, but the fact that it's completely text-based means that it has to be totally her imagination, which maybe you wouldn't get as bombastic a kind of fantasy world if it had to reflect the way video games actually looked.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I enjoyed this book. And, I do have like an issue or two with the basic story level in terms of sequential coherency and motivation. But, I think that the higher goals of the story that Grayson is telling, along with the art of Bolton and Phillips, makes up for those little bumps.
Yeah. I think overall, I think it's an interesting book. I totally read it in one sitting. It's very absorbing, and I do recommend people reading it to people to read it. And I would say read it if the idea of thinking about gaming or thinking about identity or gender fluidity is interesting to you, but even read it if it's not, because I mean, as I said at the top, I think all this stuff is a little bit outside of what my lived existence, but I because of that, I think I appreciate this book as, someone who's a little bit of a Luddite and a little bit of a traditionalist. I love reading this kind of thing to help me know what I don't know.
Yeah. So, two great books that Paul and I discussed this week. We started off with Jillian Tamaki's Boundless, and then we moved on over to User, originally coming out in 2001, but coming out just recently as a single volume, written by Devin Grayson with art by both John Bolton and Sean Phillips.
Yeah, it was a really interesting conversation, and thanks, Derek, for bringing me on to talk about these two super interesting books. And we always appreciate feedback too. So if folks have thoughts, we want to hear them. Thank you.
Definitely. And if you want to check out great books like this, then head over to the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. If you go to dcbservice.com right now, you're going to find great discounts for the month of May. And as Paul pointed out at the beginning of this episode, right now you can find User for 40% off of the cover price. That's dcbservice.com. Mm-hmm. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about this week's episode. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
If you want to reach us by email, I'm at paul@comicsalternative.com, and Derek is at derek@comicsalternative.com, or you can contact us at twoguys@comicsalternative.com. We're also on Twitter, and you can find out about our new content and updates to our blog, as well as maybe see some retweets of Holy Balls.
That's right.
We can be found at the number two guys with PhDs, and then you can also find us on Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube. Did I leave anything out, Derek?
Oh, no, that's all the social media that we're on, but you can also find the podcast on iTunes.
Yes.
You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right.
Yep, all the ways for people to get in touch with us. And, you can also not only get in touch with us, but you can be like Bob Hinsdale and Jay Loving and support us via Patreon. Go to patreon.com/comicsalternative and you'll see the various reward levels. We appreciate your support. Until next time, I'm Derek.
And I'm Paul, and have a good time.